Serious. It seems every town has their own spooky house at the end of the street. What's your town's spooky house and what's its story? Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. I lived in the spooky house growing up. My mom still lives there. The house is unique in its style. It's a 2-floor shotgun-style home, which is more unique because it's in the northeastern part of the country, U.S., not in the southern part where the shotgun style is more common. The property has a large lot, which for a while was split into 2 fields. It's now more open, but my mother has stopped having it mowed, so it's going back to nature. The house is old. As far as anyone can tell, it was built prior to the town's incorporation in 1872 and was the main part of what was a larger piece of property. When I was growing up, it was always painted a darker color, red and then a dark brown. The house still gives off weird vibes, and there are parts of the house and property not even my mom will go to. It's going to be sad that when she passes, the property will probably be split up and the house torn down for a newer build or access road to the land behind it. Growing up, weird shit happened consistently, and we were not allowed to have Ouija boards, even as a joke. Near my friend's house, there was a collapsing farmhouse down an old field road. It was called the Lazy W. Supposedly, the farmer who'd lived there had murdered his family, and their ghosts would occasionally drip blood onto the road. I was very interested in ghosts, so we had a sleepover one night in the 5th grade, and the next day we walked down to the Lazy W. It didn't seem haunted to me. It just seemed like a place where an old farm used to be. There were a lot of those, but then we noticed the blood. "See?" she exclaimed. "I told you it was real." Her little sister took off down the road. She couldn't handle it, but my friends and I stayed to look for the ghosts. We sort of found them. I noticed a bunch of birds on the power lines, and one of them took a crap. It was dark red, almost purple. Then I realized something else. There were a bunch of wild pokeberries surrounding the collapsed farmhouse. Pokeberries are poisonous to humans, but birds love them. They can also be used to make reddish-purple dye. White bird poop plus reddish-purple dye looks a lot like blood. Ew, right? So as it turns out, there were no bloody ghosts. There were only bird shits. TLDR. I was a brave kid and debunked a local ghost story, which actually had a rather surprising cause. I remember as a kid going past a gravel lot daily on my way to school. I never thought much of it, but my dad told me the history of it one day in passing. He told me there used to be a house on that old lot that belonged to a divorced lady with 3 kids. Her ex was a gold-plated asshole who, more or less, abandoned her and refused to support her and his children. She worked, but it wasn't enough, and finally she received an eviction notice. The kids were hungry. Her ex was being an even bigger asshole than usual, and the eviction notice was the icing on the cake. She went mad and began attacking her children with a hammer, killing 2 immediately and catching one in the head as he tried to run out the door, leaving a ring of blood splash on the ceiling from it. As time went by and the horror faded, the house was put up for sale multiple times, but people either wouldn't buy it or never stayed long. My dad told me you could hear screams, children laughing, and footsteps. Objects would move, and the blood stain on the ceiling where the mother had hit her son as he ran out the door kept reappearing, no matter how many times the area was painted over or the panels replaced. Eventually, it was abandoned and torn down, and now there's just a gravel lot sitting where the house was. A man, his wife, and their adult son live next door. It's all very sad from perspective now, but as a kid, they scared the shit out of me, often intentionally. The old man was just a mean old man, yelling at kids, keeping the baseballs and tennis balls that landed on his side of the fence, but the son was disturbed. Pretty normal to enter the 1-bedroom upstairs and find him across the gap staring, like hands planted on the sill and eyes fixed on the doorway. One time we were in the living room watching TV and my dad started crying. His eyes got super red and he said he tasted salt. He rubbed his face and there was salt all thrown in it. He had been sitting by the window with the box fan. I peeked outside through the other window and saw the adult son running away. The old man died when I was still a kid. His wife sometime after that, though we never saw her. The son eventually died, neglecting a terrible foot infection. I have more stories if anyone's interested. Had a shack from the late 1800s in the neighborhood. All the kids said if you went in it, you would disappear. Another rumor was that there was a witch that did a murder-suicide there and haunted the house. It's in some park right now as a tourist attraction, I think. I grew up in a small town in England, and the spooky thing all the kids were afraid of was actually a bus, not a house. When we were kids playing out in the street, we would run and hide whenever the blood-red bus drove past. This bus was an old-style bright red double-decker, which has pretty much been phased out in our town, so it was pretty rare. It would drive by only once a day, just after dark. If you saw the bus, the game was to run away and scream, "Blood red bus," or else the driver would get you. Just stupid kid stuff. Only one day, as the bus is driving past and we're all running away screaming, the bus screeches to a halt and the driver actually gets out and starts chasing us. He catches up to some of the kids, who were absolutely terrified, and tells them off for playing the game. Apparently, all the kids running and screaming whenever we saw the bus had led to a pervasive rumor at the bus depot that the driver was a pedophile. He was not amused. I have 2 towns, so I'll pick one from each. So in the town I live currently, we have many mills behind and around downtown that were said to have been haunted by the workers killed there due to unsafe conditions. Works unions aren't a thing in my state. I don't know all the stories, but I've heard some stories from old ladies who worked there as the mills were turned into antique malls. But I heard one story where one woman went into the bathroom on her break. The bathroom was empty except her and apparently one other person. She saw the woman's shoes from under the stall. The stall door was mostly closed but slightly ajar. The lady found it weird the woman would pick the only stall with a broken lock when so many were available. While she's doing her makeup and fixing her hair in the mirror, she hears the other woman groaning. So she goes back to knock on the stall door to see if the woman was okay. When she knocks, the door simply swings open and there's nothing there. She promptly got the fuck out of there. I also have a story from my hometown. The whole downtown there is completely decrepit looking, so it isn't about any creepy looking house or some dumb shit like that. It's a bridge. It's a haunted ass bridge you can't even go on anymore. It's old and wooden and many accidents happen on that bridge. An unsettling amount of cars were swerving off the side of the road when they'd crossed that bridge. My mom never allowed me to visit it. She's extremely superstitious, but I heard some stories from friends at school. The weirdest was one that didn't even include a car. So it goes like this. My friend's oldest male cousin is going to the bridge to see if it's legit that scary. He's the rebellious type, so even though he was told no, he said fuck that and snuck out anyway. He goes to the bridge with his bike. He ditched it before the bridge even starts and walks across it on foot. He said it felt wrong the minute he made more than 2 steps on this bridge. He keeps going though, out of pride. He makes it halfway and begins to feel really bad. It's super cold, the wind is blowing now, and he feels sick. Just as he decided to stop halfway and turn back, he sees someone. There was a girl just standing there, a few feet away from him, inches from where the light stopped. She held out her hand to him and whispered, "Don't leave." He said he'd never ran so fast in his life. He got on his bike and hauled ass back home. Someone saw him sneak out, and he got grounded for like a month or something. He said he wasn't even mad about it after that. The bridge is closed now. It's beyond old at that point. There's also a sign where you used to turn onto it that says, "No trespassing under any circumstances." We have the hoarder house. The thing is literally sagging right down the middle of it. No one really knows who lived there before they suddenly vacated. I'm assuming they died. There were warning signs on the front door of oxygen in use. The whole house just doesn't even look like it fits in with the rest of the small street it's on. It just sits there, abandoned, with an unknown history. It's not necessarily a creepy house look-wise, but the house right on the corner of my street has something fucked up going on with it. In the 15 years I've lived in my town, 4 of its inhabitants have died, 3 of them in the house. It's a rental, so it's not super weird that people cycle through it often, but I honestly don't think anyone's ever lived there for more than a year. I grew up in the countryside in a super small village in Germany, no man's land as I used to call it. Some of the old farmhouses weren't situated within the village, but on the fields down the road. One of them was just a ruin. We often went there as children, looking through the dusty windows. There was a table with plates and some glasses on it. Some of the buildings on the farm were just old stone walls. It was surrounded by high trees and therefore laid in darkness. An old lady often went there with her old rusty car. She had long gray hair and didn't really like people around. We'd hide behind trees till she's gone. One day, I went to the fields to do some nature photography. Of course, I went to the farmhouse as well. Made some shots of the buildings and the trees. Nice atmosphere, you know? Then suddenly there was a cat staring at me. How cute. Then there was another and another. All over the place, on the roof, behind the old walls. They came from everywhere, like 30 cats or something, just sitting there silently staring at me. I very, very slowly went back, not turning my eyes away from these cats, walking through the bushes and trees towards the field, took my bike and went away. The building was bought by a photographer a few years ago, and it's now a pretty place to live. But for us, it will always be the cat house. LOL. Literally had a spooky house at the end of the street I grew up on. I don't know much behind the history of the house, but as a child, my friends and I decided to go inside and take a look. I posted this before, but here's our story. I'll try to give a little more detail than before. For the majority of my childhood life, there was this dilapidated, ominous-looking house at the end of my street. The vegetation completely took over their yard to the point where it was just a dense forest. Vines covered a good portion of the sides of the house. Weeds crammed their way into the cracks of the wooden planks of the patio. Paint was heavily flaked or gone in some parts, and the roof tiles weren't faring much better, many of which were missing. It had been the talk amongst the children of our community, and one day my friends and I unanimously decided we'd explore the contents of this house. So we first attempted to enter through the front patio, but the floorboards between the front door and the steps were broken or gone, so we decided to look around the house to find another way in. Fortunately, just down the poorly managed gravel driveway, we found the back door, so we slipped inside. Pretty much the entire house was barren of any furniture, pictures, or anything that would indicate anyone living there. The back porch was dusty and the floorboards were cracked, and a thick layer of dust hung around the windowsills. We walk into what we think was the kitchen. The wallpaper, is that the right word, was badly peeling. Cupboards were all open or their doors were removed. Everything was empty. Pretty much this was the same for every room we went into, just empty. We started to go into the basement, but we were pretty chicken shit to go down there, especially since we didn't have a flashlight. Just felt too ominous. It gave us chills. We'd seen enough horror movies to know that was a good place to die, LOL. There was one room on the main floor we didn't go inside. All the doors in the house were opened except that particular one. For whatever reason, we saw that and decided not to go in. Well, after being there for about 30 minutes or so, we decided to head out. A little disappointed we didn't see or find anything particularly interesting, we leave through the back porch and we begin walking down the gravel driveway. At some point, I look up to the house into one of the windows. A well-dressed, well-kept elderly man, I'd guess in his 60s or early 70s, in a dress coat and tie, stood at the center of the window expressionless, looking down upon my friends and I. We all see this, and without a word just book it the fuck out of there. My one friend pissed himself, and we were all understandably shooken up after that. I'm more of a rational person now, so I think it may have just been the property owner who shut himself in that room we didn't go in, probably afraid of us, LOL. Or maybe he was in the basement. Either way, we never heard him the entire time we were there. A couple of years later, the fire department burnt the house down in a controlled burn, so now it's just an empty lot. It was my bloody house. My parents did like a wild garden look with native grasses and trees with shade. We also had a giant wired-haired pointer who liked to hang out in the shadows and give a single deep bark at passers-by. Some of the little kids on the street said a witch lived there. It was me in my goth phase. I was the witch. I became part of the street mythos. There's this old jailhouse in my city. It was used to both house people awaiting trial and people who were about to be executed. The top floor was also used for executions. There was supposedly much violence before it shut down, and supposedly even more murders and gang wars inside the building after it was abandoned. You can't legally go inside, but people who have reported some weird shit. One supposedly saw shadows and distorted bloody faces in mirrors. Another went to the top floor where they saw a bloody noose. They were then pushed and fell down 10 floors. I kind of want to explore this building, but also kind of don't. Crackheads are scarier than ghosts. The Chamber House. a large house made out of rock that has been around since the early 1900s. Story goes in the 20s the area was really rural. This was the only house on a long stretch of road that was occasionally used by out-of-towners to bypass the town itself. The owner of the house was the town butcher. At night, he would litter the road with bent nails to get cars to stop. Once they were stopped with multiple flat tires, they'd have no choice but to start walking. Eventually, they'd see his porch lights and would naturally approach to ask for help. He was a serial killer that dismembered his victims and had chambered his house to have dedicated sections for each body part. So one room was the leg chamber, one room was the torso chamber, etc. He managed to kill 28 people, possibly more, moving the cars to be concealed by the woods behind his house, before the town became suspicious enough to investigate. When authorities finally raided his house, they found the various chambers that had walls lined with body parts, one for hands, one for arms, one for legs, one for heads, and one for torsos. They realized that there wasn't a room for feet. In fact, no feet were found anywhere in the house or surrounding area. One room was filled with bone dust, however. At the center of this room was a meat grinder and processing table. It quickly became apparent that the killer was stripping the meat from the feet and grinding it up, most likely feeding the town feet meat for 2 decades. When I was very young, an old lady lived in the house behind me. She would just kinda sit and watch everyone 24/7. She once saw me break into my own house, but that's a different story. All the kids were scared of her. One of the kids had to get a ball from the yard, and turns out she was super nice. I think she died because one day she wasn't there, and shortly after, new people moved in. This is actually fairly new. In the community I live in, a 2-story house was busted for having almost 100 illegal immigrants packed in there. They were all living in terrible conditions. From my understanding, they were actually being held hostage. The owners of the place were the ones who brought the immigrants, not sure from where, don't ask, and it cost big bucks. The owners were threatening the immigrants and their families to pay up, and since these people are here illegally, they feared going to the police. It all ended when a family member had enough and called the cops. The house is boarded up, and my mom calls it La Casa Maldita. It's creepy driving past that house and knowing I've passed by before when almost 100 people were in there being held hostage. I was 14 when me and my friends went to the spooky house of our small town, which was the house of a known serial killer and kidnapper, to some stories, and we decided to enter the house, found your usual abandoned house things like debris and random broken things, but we ended up finding bones. Didn't know if they were human or animal, but then we heard someone running above us the stairs, and we booked it. I have never ran so fast in my life. We never looked back. Turns out there was a squatter who lived there, was known for trying to stab people and steal their money. I've never again entered an abandoned house. First one's not really a house. It's an old hotel from the 1800s called the Gower House. Half of it collapsed after a fire, but several presidents and important people stayed there, and I'm fairly sure there was rumors of a murder there. Was a relative of John Adams, I think. Second one's the house behind it. Been abandoned for years, but it was heavily collapsing. I think a fire got it a few years ago, so it's gone now, but it supposedly had a door in the closet that led to a tunnel near the river so that slaves could cross it to freedom in the north. I don't know of any spooky stuff regarding it, except it just straight up looked spooky.